So in this video, we're going to look at how to use functions inside of Python. Now, functions have several purposes. One is to reduce the amount of code that we have to write. Now, that might seem counterintuitive at first because we have to write a little bit of extra code for the function. However, when we start writing a lot of code and we have to recall similar types of things, we can use functions in order to make our lives a little bit simpler. So functions are going to help us with that. Secondly, functions will allow us to logically organize our code. That way we can group like pieces of code together and make it easier to run. Now, a function doesn't have to be very complicated. We're going to look at a very simple function here, but it'll show us how we can create a function and how to call the function. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our function definition. To do so, we're going to start with def. This allows us to define our function. Then we need to give it a function name. We have here print hello. A function name follows the same rules as a variable name inside of Python. It must be made up of letters, underscores, and numbers. It cannot start with a number, and it is case sensitive. Finally, a function name cannot be a reserved word inside of Python. Next thing we need to do is have an open and close parentheses. In the future, we'll put things inside those parentheses, but for right now, we're not going to use anything here. And then next, we'll create our function body, but before we do that, we need to put a colon. This might be similar to, for example, a loop or a conditional statement you've seen before. This first part is called a function definition, or sometimes called a function header. And this just lets us define our function and say what it's going to look like, so we know how to call it. Next, we're going to create the body of our function. In this case, we're just going to print hello world. Now, this might seem similar to, for example, the original hello world, and you're correct, but we're showing how to do this within a function call this time. Now, in order to call a function, all we need to do is call the function name with the open and close parentheses. That's because as of right now, our function definition does not have anything inside of it. Switch to my command console. When I run it, you'll notice hello world displays. What happens is we go through their lines. We see the print hello function call. That goes up to our function definition and runs the body of our function. And this is called calling a function. I can even have functions call other functions. So let's take an example of that. I'm going to create a new function definition. In this case, we're going to call it main. Now, inside of main, I'm going to print a command that's going to let us know that we're inside of main. Then I'm going to call print hello. And then one more print to let them know that we're exiting main. Now, before we were only calling print hello. So I've added a call to our main function. This shows us that we can call a function from another function as well as calling that function directly from our main application. I'm going to save as file. Switch back to my console window. Run it again. You'll notice that main is called first. I see my print statement for inside of main function, hello world, and exiting main function. Then I see another hello world, and that's because we call the print hello function directly. So you can see when we call it from one function versus calling a function directly. And we can have functions that call functions that call functions that call functions, and in large complicated applications, that's actually not that uncommon. We can even get into a special case where a function calls itself, and that's called recursion. Now, recursion is a bit of an advanced topic, and it can be a bit tricky, so we're not going to talk about it at this point. We just want to show what can happen with a basic function call. Let's look at another example where we're going to be doing a basic function call. We're not going to pass in any values. However, we're going to deal with a local variable. I'm going to create a function called main once again. And in this case, I'm going to create a variable called name. And we're going to assign it a value from an input. Now, name is a variable that is defined inside of our main function. If I call name inside of my main function, it's familiar with it because it is defined inside there. It is inside what's referred to as its scope. That variable is within that function's scope, or how many variables and which variables it can see. Scope is important because we don't want to see other functions' variables. That can get very confusing. Because name is only inside of the main function, I can't call it anywhere else. We're going to come down here and see what happens when we try to access name outside of the main function. I'm going to switch to my console window and run my functions2 file. Please enter name. Notice that we see the hello Walter, which is the name that I gave it, and that runs correctly. However, when we go and try to access name later on, it comes up and says on line 9 that it is not defined. That's because it was defined inside of a function and my main application cannot see it. So that's just an idea of how scope works, where you can see a variable inside of a function, but outside a function you can't. Very important is you have larger and larger applications where you might share variable names. You would never want to accidentally overwrite a variable's value because you use the same name that maybe another developer did. So that's why scope is so important, and a type of error that you get if you try to use a variable that's not within your scope.